Yes.
Shalom. Welcome to everyone. I'm Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal. I'm the CEO of the Rabbinical Assembly and the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. I want to welcome you, everyone here today. It's so exciting to have hundreds of people from around the world gathered together to study today, to learn with wonderful experts and teachers the halachot around using technology on Shabbat and Yom Tov on the holidays. First of all, I want to thank Mauricio Balter and Phil Scheim of Masorti Olami and their staff for putting everything together today and bringing us together so that we can have this global discussion. And I want to thank everyone for making time today to come to present or to participate, to listen and learn along with all of us together. Today we're going to learn about two opinions about the use of technology on Shabbat and Yom Tov, on holidays, but really they can lead to a multitude of different ways in which we might use these technologies or refrain from using them to enhance our sense of holidays and Shabbat. The Rabbinical Assembly, the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, Masorti Olami, all of us are here to support you in your decisions as congregations, communities, and rabbis and other clergy come together to make these decisions. We're not here to present one or the other as the way to do it in your community. Our approach as a conservative Masorti movement is not that we have a unity of practice, but rather a unity of approach. Our approach is understanding that our observances and traditions evolve over time and in particular communities and places to meet the needs of the Jewish people in this moment, in this place. And therefore, we actually need more halakha and not less. We need more options, not fewer. We need to look deeply into our texts and into our traditions, look deeply into our souls and into our communities, and come to an understanding together in each community of what our practice might be and how we can best bring our communities together to enhance our observance and celebration of Shabbat and Yom Tov. It's my pleasure now to turn to Ilana Garber of the Rabbinical Assembly to continue this introduction, and then we'll begin our program. Ilana is on mute.
There we go. Hi. Shalom, everyone, and thanks. It's a pleasure to be able to join so many here today in this global conversation. As I've just started in my position at our Rabbinical Assembly as the Director of Global Rabbinic Development, I'm eager to get to know each of you and to help you, especially in this challenging time. One of my goals is to support our rabbis across the globe through continuing rabbinic education, mentoring, partnerships, and resources of all kinds. Speaking of resources, I hope you'll check out cjhighholidays.org. I'll put the link exactly in the chat. A website that's been created by our partners at USCJ, the RACA, the Jewish Educators Assembly, and NAASE, the North American Association of Synagogue Executives. While it may trend toward North American congregations, there are fabulous resources there that may be applicable to all. And finally, when we think of resources, while there are just 46 days until Erev Rosh Hashanah, there are 76 days only until Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan. So please be on the lookout for a very special opportunity for our global colleagues starting on Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan, October 18th. We're planning a week of nourishment, renewal, and self-care for our rabbis and cantors, and we hope you'll join us. More on that soon. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator today. Rabbi Dr. Analia Bortz is the first female Latin American rabbi ordained by the Seminario who completed her studies at Machon Schachter in Jerusalem. She was chosen by the BBC as the most influential woman around the world for her work on infertility and mental illness, and by the Forward as one of 50 most influential shakers and makers in 2019. Originally from Argentina, after 20 years in Atlanta and the founder of Congregation Or Hadash along with her husband, Rabbi Analia made Aliyah 2 weeks ago and she lives in Yerushalayim. She's most proud of being mother of two fabulous daughters, Adina, who made Aliyah 5 years ago, and Tamar with her husband Brian, who landed in Israel making Aliyah just a few hours ago. So, Bruchim Habaim, and welcome to all, Dr. Analia Bortz. Rabbi.
Shalom from Yerushalayim. It's just a blessing to be here. It's wonderful to be at home, to feel at home. And it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces from the last 30 years of being a pulpit rabbi, along with my husband, Rabbi Mario Karpuch. And it's just wonderful that all of us are here in Yerushalayim. So today is a day of Shehecheyanu for the Masorti movement, for the Rabbinical Assembly, for the conservative movement. I feel that Jacob Frank is gonna look at us and say, like, what is going on there? And here we are. What we are seeing here is a group of rabbis, a group of clergy, a group of lay people that really cares all over the world, from Australia, New Zealand maybe, all the way to Chile, and all the way, of course, to America, Canada, etc. And today we have the incredible opportunity to learn from each other and with each other. So this is a conversation that is not something that will bring us as a confrontational thing. It's a conversation in order to learn from and with each other. And as we do I would like to remind everyone how we are going to do this. First of all, Rabbi Heller is going to expose his 34 pages Teshuva, in which he will share with us his incredible and very, very talented way of looking at the text. Rabbi Amy Levin is gonna expose her dissent on this on the Teshuva of Rabbi Heller, and she will bring from herself her view, and then Rabbi Chaim Wiener from the UK, from the United Kingdom, is gonna bring his own way of doing it all over. So this is Masorti Olami and the Rabbinical Assembly. And basically what we are doing today is to say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim Chaim. These and these are the way that God allows all of us to bring from ourselves, to bring the conversation, to make it alive, to make it relevant, to bring into the next generation, to make it something that we can live with and not something that is going to be an obstacle for us. We are in the 21st century and we have different etgarim, different challenges. And of course, with the pandemic and the COVID-19, we have some of us need to adjust to different challenges of being exposed to those challenges. In the Talmud Bavli, in Avodah Zarah, it says, Kol alomed Torah merab echad eino roeh siman bracha leolam, which means one who studies Torah from only one teacher will never achieve a sign of blessing. That means that actually our rabbis allow us to hear from this side and from that side, to be allowed to learn, to grow intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, because all the opinions are worthy, as long as we respect each other in everybody else's opinions. So let me introduce you to this first speaker, my very good friend, Rabbi Joshua Heller. Rabbi Heller is an expert in technology in Jewish life and law. After graduating from Harvard with high honors in computer science and publishing a paper in the Journal for Computational Neuroscience, he turned down Silicon Valley job. I want to repeat that. He turned down Silicon Valley job, offers, and he attended the JTS and became a 9th generation rabbi in his family. What an honor. He's a longtime member of the Law Committee on Standards and serves as its Rites and Rituals Chair. He's the senior rabbi of Congregation of B'nai Torah in Sandy Springs, Georgia, but mostly he's my friend, he's my husband's friend, and he's an incredible, incredible mensch. So this is my opportunity to introduce to you Rabbi Joshua Heller and his wonderful Teshuva on streaming and Zooming on Shabbat.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. My mom is on the call. I know she was very happy to hear. So I just want to start by saying that I'm very happy that this is an international conversation. My father, Alav Shalom, was president of Masorti Olami, and he was one of the rabbis who understood that this is a global movement. This is not just something that happens in America. And I'm glad that we are having this conversation with a global approach. But I also recognize that America is very different from the rest of the world. So I am in the state of Georgia, where COVID is just totally out of control, as opposed to the rest of the world where people, circumstances are, God willing, different. So it's a 34-page tshuva. It's very difficult to summarize, but I want to give you some highlights. One is what drove this tshuva. So one thing is, streaming on Shabbat was already a phenomenon even before this. Even before this happened, about 15% of conservative synagogues in the US were offering some kind of one-way stream, and another 60 to 70% have started in the last few months, and many more are thinking about it. So part of this is the barn door, if you will. The ball had already started rolling for this to happen, and we wanted to be ahead of the trend, or at least understand what was going to happen. One of the biggest arguments that I make here is one of pikuach nefesh and sakanat nefashot. Now the issue is, if something is dangerous, you can simply not do it, right? We could simply say, if it is dangerous to get people together to pray, we are not going to do it for 6 months or a year. The problem is that there are actually negative impacts of doing that. One being that going that long without community is really harmful for people. The other thing is that people are tempted to do dumb things if smarter options are not available to them. So the example that was given is, there was a time when people would give out condoms, even though sex outside of marriage, and by the way, the use of condoms itself, is problematic, because the alternative was people getting sick. And we know, even from here in America, synagogues that are having services live, people are coming even though they may have been exposed, even though they're being sick, and it is causing risks. So allowing another option is a very important escape valve for congregations not to feel pressured to open and have live services, which would lead to illness and death. So there is an issue here of sha'at hadchak, which is that we are in a very pressing moment where there are circumstances which are not usual. I recognize, by the way, that something that happens bishat hadchak in an unusual moment, people will look back to it as a precedent later. I'm going to come back to that. I want to point out some of the background of what we're talking about. In 2001, Rabbi Avi Reisner wrote a tshuva that I recommend you to read about remote services. And he says, I think with a very firm basis in the Shulchan Aruch, Orech Chaim 5513, that as long as you have 10 people in one place, people viewing and hearing from anyone else can be a part of that group. The question of, quote unquote, a Zoom minyan, what if 10 people are not all in the same place, is a much more complicated question. I think that is, and I was one of the people who argued for a Zoom minyan in the current circumstances. I think that is not something that will continue after the current pandemic. If people have questions about that, we can talk about it during the Q&A. But for the purposes of our conversation today, the question is, what about Shabbat? So our tradition has a long-standing tradition of saying that there are things that we can set up before Shabbat to enjoy on Shabbat, even though you could not do them on Shabbat. So I can put food on a blech before Shabbat and have it continue to stay warm. The classic source is, I can leave my mill running on Shabbat as long as people know that I put the grain in before Shabbat, right? Many of us use Shabbat clocks. The very idea of Shabbat candles, right? Lighting a fire is forbidden on Shabbat, but we light a fire just before Shabbat and we say a bracha over it so that we have the opportunity to have light on Shabbat. So that's the general principle. The challenge that we have is that many of the things from a technical standpoint many of the things involved in using a computer on Shabbat or a phone or another communications device are malacha, are labor that is forbidden on Shabbat. So we have agreed, I think, across the movement that electricity is not fire. So there are some people who say that electricity is like fire. Even though my laptop gets warm, I would not try to cook my sandwich on it. It would not be good for the laptop. On the other hand, we do understand that one of the things prohibited on Shabbat is kotev, is making a permanent record. And a lot of what we do on Shabbat, what we do with technology involves making a permanent record. This session is being recorded right now. Also, equipment breaks or needs to be fixed. And so there's a principle of makeba patish, requiring getting something that is not working to work again. And that can also be an issue. So running through on a high level the issues in this tshuva, one question that comes up is the work that we are doing by streaming d'oraita, is it work which is forbidden by the Torah? Or is it d'Rabbanan? Is it work that is forbidden by a rabbinic decree? So for example, writing a permanent something is forbidden by the Torah. Writing something that will later be erased, that will not last, is only forbidden rabbinically. So when I talk about using technology on Shabbat, the preference is that it be something that is set up before Shabbat and what does not have to touch it. So for example, if you have a camera in the sanctuary and the stream is just going out and everyone logs in before Shabbat, and whenever you look, you're seeing whatever's going on in the sanctuary. Is it, and it's one on the bima, if you log in at 2, if you're looking at 2 in the morning, the room is dark, whatever it is. That is the best option. And I think that is an option which is entirely defensible, even not b'shat hatzchak. That is something that fits in with everything that our tradition has always said about Shabbat. The challenge is that that's not always the way the world works. So for example, a technology that a lot of people are using is Zoom, and Zoom, no matter what you do, requires fiddling. So I suggest one of two things. One, Amira Akum, having a non-Jewish person available to help with the technology, and they don't have to be in the same place where you are. And the other thing is that there are workarounds, which b'shat hatzchak, at a time that is unusual, a pressing situation, one can use to get around a rabbinic decree, but not a biblical decree. So for example, if you're trying to unmute, if you somehow got muted, hitting the space bar with your elbow is an unusual, doing it in an unusual way is not considered a violation, would be an example. Or the other issue would be there's something called grama, which is if I do something and the cause is indirect. So one of the things that we've been debating is if you have a voice-activated computer and you say, hey Siri, that is not necessarily direct action because the computer actually is making a decision, quote unquote. It's not an independent actor, but the action is independent enough of yours that it is considered to not be direct causation. Now, the issue of having a non-Jew may not be practical in an Israeli community. You may not have someone non-Jewish easily available to you, right? In some communities that may not be practical. And the rules of Amira Akum are quite complicated. The example that I like to give is in some communities, the non-Jewish custodian makes coffee on Shabbat. In some, he or she might not. And so how you think about how you make coffee, or even how food is prepared or warmed or kept warm on Shabbat, these are all of the loopholes that we have come up with to deal with these kinds of situations. Another issue that comes up is muktzeh, which is the idea that if something is not supposed to be used on Shabbat, that you should not be touching it on Shabbat. And there are ways around that as well. But again, my preference would be that someone not be touching the computer equipment on Shabbat, that a Jewish person would just sit down and get ready to go. Now, by the way, all of this requires planning. So this past Shabbat morning, I went to shul and the internet at the shul was down. And so I had to run home and sit at my desk here where I had left my computer on as a backup just in case. And by the way, it is entirely possible that it might not work one week. But the truth is almost all of us, some week don't end up not making it to shul one reason or another. There's a difference between missing 1 week and missing a year. Of course, there's additional pressure on the high holidays, which is again where I think having backups and Amir al-Akum, having someone who is not Jewish available in case of emergency is very important. There's another challenge, which is that even if I am doing everything right, so we leave our Zoom active for all of Shabbat, and there are a few people who leave their computer logged in like I do, I know that 95% of the people are just logging on Shabbat, and at least on a rabbinic level are violating Shabbat by doing so. Now then again, here in the US, when I had services open, 95% of the people in my shul were driving into shul and parking in my parking lot. I would actually argue that turning on a computer on Shabbat is less of a violation of Shabbat than a gasoline burning car. If you have an electric car, we could have a different conversation. You could log into services on your car, I don't know. But there is a principle in Jewish law of, lifnei iver lo titen michshol, that we should not put a stumbling block before the blind. So if we are offering something that is encouraging people to log in on Shabbat, to use technology on Shabbat, are we not tempting people to sin? So I have two responses. One is, most of the people who are logging into Shabbat it's not like they were not using their computers before, they were just watching Netflix instead of my sermon. And there you go. The other thing is that with lifnei iver, if you allow a kosher way to do something and someone chooses to do it in a non-kosher way, then that is not lifnei iver. So for example, if I invite someone to come have Shabbat dinner in my house, and I offer them the opportunity, you can stay over, you can walk, and they choose to drive, that's on them, that's not on me. There's also the larger principle that hopefully over time, I'm drawing people close. Now, bigger picture, the devil is in the details. The challenge is that technology doesn't always work. So the last 3 pages of my tshuva are a technical appendix for how to get around some of the issues of mute and unmute, which come up, to get around the issues of Zoom will only last for 24 hours. So we are working as a rabbinical assembly, to see if we can get Zoom to allow an extended meeting of 48 hours or longer. And I've talked to some of their engineers and we're really trying to see if they'll do that for us. We're also talking to a different company about developing an alternative solution to Zoom. And whichever one of those seems like it is going to work, we will try to make available to the movements and to everyone beyond, but we just won't know which works until we know. Let me zoom out a little bit, some pun intended, to the bigger question, which is, what does this mean for us? So what does this mean for synagogues? So people say, well, will people not come back to shul? What happens when this is all over? And so I think Yatsa hefsedo bischaro, that there will definitely be people who will be watching services online and not coming in person. But I think there are also many more people who will be doing something Jewish because it's available in a format that they like. So some of you here in America, we have this phenomenon called Peloton, where it's a bike with a screen on it. And there are thousands, people are waiting months to get one of these in their house so that they can ride an exercise bike in their house, but see an instructor somewhere else guiding them. And I think there are a lot of people who are looking for that in their spirituality. Now, granted, we don't have to offer that on Shabbat, but I think the world, even when this is all over, 3 years from now, there's a vaccine, Kenahara, that we are still going to have this issue of people looking for their religious experiences online. and we are going to have to be ready. So not every shul has to do this, but this is, in many communities, people are going to be looking for this. We are also looking at the question of what does it mean just for the world to change. So when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, we went to a whole new way of worship, right? We still talked about korbanot, about sacrifices, but we had daily prayer. Synagogues already existed, but they took the front. I don't think that what is as happening as big as Korban Habayit, but it is probably at least as big as the invention of the printing press and the book. And think about that, how that changed Judaism. What coronavirus has done is it accelerated a trend that already started. Remember, there are synagogues that have been streaming their services for years. And I think what's going to happen is in many outside of the Orthodox world, it is going to become a greater expectation. And I think what will be different is how we decide to do it. Now, it may be like instrumental music. So my synagogue does not do instrumental music on Shabbat. We actually don't even sing very much during the week. You know, when they said, you know, singing is very dangerous, it could spread coronavirus, like, yes, we're in no trouble at all. But we are definitely facing a world where things are changing. So the question is, how do you preserve Shabbat? So our tradition understands that the letter and the spirit of the law sometimes don't talk to each other so well. That's why we invented the Eruv and the Blech, right? So we invented, right? You leave your oven on, but you put something over the oven so you don't mess with the control. So literally on Shabbat, I put my Siddur on my keyboard so I remember not to type and check my email. You know, we invented the Eruv. I think I may actually write one of these for the high holidays unless one of our liturgists comes up with one, which is like the Eruv Adain, right? That somehow, you know, I'm going to put a hard-boiled egg next to my keyboard so that I will remember, right, that what I am doing is actually a compromise to enable me to have a holy time. But I also bring us back to the principle of Shabbat candles. The Torah says, lo teva'aru esh. The Torah says, don't light a fire, don't have a fire lit in your house on Shabbat. That's what the Karaites said. We're going to sit in the dark on Shabbat. And the rabbi said, no, just before Shabbat, light the candle. And there's a whole chapter of Talmud talking about how you light it. We actually our chapter of Talmud that we write, maybe not bamem madlikin, with what you light, but bamem melagin, like with what do you log in? You know, I wish it didn't have to be this way, you know, but this is the world we're living in. And I think what marks us as a movement is the ability to hold on to the traditions, to remain living within the letter of the law, while also living in the larger world. And again, I can't underemphasize the importance, at least in some communities right now, of pikuach nefesh. So I mentioned earlier that, you know, our services on Shabbat, I got to shul, the internet wasn't working, I had to come home. This was supposed to be our first Shabbat with a bat mitzvah family back in the sanctuary. They were not there because they tested positive for coronavirus erev Shabbat and they had to be home. And they only tested because they were being extra careful. If they had not been a very careful and sensitive family, we would be in a very different, I would be in a very different situation today. So I think we really have to think, on the one hand, circumstances that apply here in Georgia don't apply everywhere else in the world, but that even after coronavirus, there are still going to be people for whom it is going to be dangerous to come out. People who are in cancer treatment, people who are frail for one reason or another, people who are isolated, and having some kind of way for them to access community is going to be very important. So with that, I'm going to stop. I want to thank the RA for giving us this chance. I know there will be many questions. And I just want to say, I also have tremendous kavod for my colleague, for Rabbi Amy Levin. I know that this is one of those cases where Talmidei Chachamim being in debate with each other strengthens our tradition.
Thank you, Rabbi Heller. It's a pleasure to listen to you, to learn Torah from you. I want to remind everyone that, first of all, we have 5 books of Torah, 6 books of Mishnah, and 63 tractates of Talmud. And that says something about our incredible treasure that we all share in our tradition. So with that sense of our rabbis, the Tanaim and the Amoraim that have inspired us in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, we are today sitting and we can say, Ashreinu ma tov chelkeinu u'ma na'im goralenu u'ma yafa yerushatenu. How fortunate we are to have this incredible tradition that is coming to us, that not necessarily is teaching us one voice, but is teaching us many voices. And that's the reason I said before, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. These and these are the words of a speaking God. We will hear from one side and the other side. We'll hear about practice today in different places in the world. And it's my pleasure, after Rabbi Heller have talked about pikuach nefesh, to save the soul, sakanat nefashot, the danger of the souls, horaat hasha'ah, what we are teaching for the moment, sha'at adchak, which is what we have to change because it's an urgency for the moment, Amirale Akum, which is to bring someone from the outside world, a Gentile, to serve us or for our purposes. Lifnei iber lo tite milchol, don't you put a standard block in front of a blind person. The concept of ketiva, the concept of recording and how they will write about that, and the concept of muse, the things that are not allowed on Shabbat. Rabbi Amy Levin, my dear, dear friend, Rabbi Amy Levin. We know each other for about 27 years. We have studied together here in Jerusalem about 27 years ago. Rabbi Amy Levin, the second woman ordained by the Shechter Rabbinical Seminary of the Masorti movement in Jerusalem, has trained in the Rab Amachshir program of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and the Consulting for Vital Congregations programs. Rabbi Amy Levin is the Alban Institute, or for the Vital Congregations of the Alban Institute. Rabbi Amy Levin has served on the faculty of the Shechter Institute, the Hebrew Union College, and the Conservative Yeshiva. Since 2011, Rabbi Levin has served in the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the International Rabbinical Assembly. She returned to Israel in the summer of 2016 and lives in Kibbutz Hanaton in the northern part of the country. Once again, let me introduce my friend, Rabbi Amy Levin. She doesn't take anything for granted. She really analyzes everything. She teaches us with her mind, with her heart, and with her soul. But mostly, she teaches us with her actions, because whatever she touches, she makes of that gold. So, Rabbi Amy Levin, the stage is yours.
I'm afraid to open my mouth after an introduction like that. That was overwhelming. Thank you so much, Analia. First of all, it's just such a joy that you're in Israel, and I'm looking forward to being in the same place at the same time with you. The first thing I wrote on my page of notes of what I wanted to discuss today was Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim, which of course Rabbi Bortz has already mentioned a few times. I have another way of making that point. We often joke about 2 Jews and 3 opinions and kind of roll our eyes and sigh. But I think that 2 Jews and 3 opinions is actually the strength of our tradition. From the earliest efforts of the Chachamim, of the sages in the Mishnaic period, we are witness to an ethos of mutual respect. The opinions of Beit Hillel are held in higher esteem or are given precedence over the opinions of the House of Hillel from time to time, because as the texts teach us, the school of Hillel took the trouble to also study the opinions of the school of Shammai. And so their view was broader and their understanding of issues was deeper. All of that being said, I'm much, much happier when Rabbi Heller and I are on the same side of an issue, and we have actually written a dissent together, so sometimes we are on the same side. But in this particular instance, with regret, I needed to write this dissent to Rabbi Heller's Teshuva. It's important for me to point out that my paper is not a Teshuva. It has not passed a vote in the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, as has Rabbi Heller's Teshuva. Mine is a dissent. It's a dat yachid. It's the opinion of one member of the committee. I begin the paper with a methodology that I use when I am addressing a question of Jewish law, or when I am going to write a sermon, or my starting place is always to go back to the basics, to go back to the roots. In this instance, my feeling was that the roots of this conversation need to be in the essence of Rabbinic Judaism, which is, as I mentioned before, mutual respect for opposing opinions. But our sages who sat around those early tables in the houses of study came to those tables with two major commitments. One was a question. Here we are in a different time at a different place than Moshe and our ancestors who were in the desert. We are now in a different society. We are in a different economy. We are in a different culture. The Hebrew we are speaking in the land of Israel now is not the Hebrew that our ancestors spoke in the desert. So how do we maintain our commitment to the Torah when our foundational document is speaking from a culture and speaking a language that we do not entirely understand? And how do we interpret what the Torah expects of us, what our part of the Brit, the covenant with God, is, when we have all of these barricades, all of these barriers to understanding in depth what our commitment to this covenant is meant to be? That's the overarching question of Rabbinic Judaism, which is still the question to this day. When Rabbi Heller and I sit around the table, or used to, who knows when we're going to do that again, but when we used to sit around the table, the question about whatever the question was about is basically, so what now? Given our reality, given the technology, given our culture, given the constantly developing scientific knowledge that is at our disposal, what now? How do we keep going with this covenant with God when our reality is changing all of the time? The other part of that commitment, the other thing that to me is essential to this process of Rabbinic Judaism, is a certain kind of theological and halachic humility. We very, very, very rarely say there is only one answer to this question. There are different approaches. There are different nuances. There are different ways that we can approach an issue. We're never going to get past shrimp being traced, but aside from some pretty simple questions like that, we are in discussion all of the time because there are so many different approaches from people who are coming with humility and integrity to these questions. So my starting point in approaching this issue is, how do we maintain our commitment to this covenant from Sinai in this time and in this place with this reality? And how do I approach this question with humility, acknowledging that there are going to be other opinions that are being presented to the community with the same sense of integrity and honesty as my own? The first thing that strikes me in this conversation is this issue of shat atzchak, this issue of we are in a moment that presents an imminent danger. The question is, what is being threatened in this particular moment? Clearly, the health of individual people is under threat in this moment, especially in cultures and in communities where people are not observing physical distancing, are not wearing masks, are not washing hands, are not doing all of those things that the people who know the science are urging us to do. That is clearly the case. It is not equally clear to me that the well-being and the existence and the integrity of our communities is equally under threat from this pandemic, the way the health of individuals is under threat by this pandemic. I'm often, and I admit I sort of have the luxury of sometimes looking at these things from the outside because I live in Israel. But sometimes I step back and I look, and it occurs to me that public opinion gets swept away in the momentum of a particular issue that is rising with urgency in America, but it happens in Israel too. It happens in Europe as well. And we sometimes get so swept up in this that we forget to step back and to look around and to see what our reality really is. I'm reminded of in not that long ago, 2013, 15, 18, there were a whole string of these pandemic movies, Contagion, Outbreak, Pandemic. And what amazes me is that people are actually watching these movies now. It can't be good for a person's sense of security and well-being to be watching these literally horror movies, right? And I think it's hard to step out of that sense of being swept into the tide and being able to say, you know, it's terrible. This virus is rampant, but that doesn't mean that everything in my world is threatened and everything in my world needs to change. One of the things that I'm saying in my dissent is we don't know yet. We don't know how long our daily lives are going to be limited by COVID-19. We do not know how long we are going to need to observe physical distancing and masks and hand washing and all of these other things. We literally do not know. I have faith that scientists who are working on therapies and on vaccines are going to come up with those things well and more quickly than has ever been done before. I'm not talking about 6 months or 8 months or 10 months. It's going to be a year or so, probably, maybe even more. But that's still going to be faster than it's ever happened before. In the meantime, my feeling is we need to step back and take a look around and see what is the essence of community. Our tradition pushes us to live in community. It pushes us in among the more traditional of us to live within walking distance of each other. And even if we don't live within walking distance of each other, we are still in some sort of a geographic area that creates some sense of geographic closeness. It makes it possible for us to reach out to people in our community who may be around the block from each other in our suburban neighborhood. Sometimes we don't even know who in our neighborhood are members of our synagogue. I would say that this is the opportunity for us to do some out-of-the-box creative thinking to build a sense of community, to build up our own sort of vaccination against loneliness and against a sense of isolation by creating grassroots efforts to build community in personal ways, in small group ways, to put into the hands of members of our communities the capability to blow a shofar, to lead a service or to lead a part of a service, to create small neighborhood groups or groups that can go stand out of the window of people who are homebound and blow the shofar for them, or to read a prayer with them. We also have 6 days a week when we can easily Zoom and stream and do all of those things and create such a sense of closeness and such a sense of embrace through all of those tools of 6 days a week that we do not need to use those same tools on Shabbat. I had suggested some brainstorming at the end of my dissent. Not because every idea that I presented there was going to work in every congregation or in any particular congregation, but just to show what the possibilities are. People who are on the ground in different communities are the ones to determine what could possibly happen as an alternative to using Zooming and using streaming on Shabbat. And some of those things can be creative and innovative and engaging in ways that probably people haven't really considered before, because it was so easy to just come to shul on Shabbat. It was part of a manganon, part of an ongoing rhythm of the week. I think for many people, shul is on Shabbat or on Chag. It happens on Friday night and Saturday morning. It happens during the Chag. It doesn't necessarily happen during the rest of the week. But my colleagues, rabbis in congregations and presidents of congregations and staff of congregations will tell you that there's a tremendous amount that's going on during the week as well. Jewish community doesn't only happen on Shabbat. And we need to perhaps take a look at the things that are happening during the week and highlight those and promote those and get people engaged during those 6 days instead of doing those things on Shabbat. In terms of the halachic argument, I took exception to Rabbi Heller's interpretation of Shat HaDchak, because I don't believe that we are at the edge of this existential abyss in terms of Jewish community, and so I don't feel that we need to allow these latitudes in the interpretation of Jewish law at this time. Certainly not in a blanket way. Perhaps there is an individual congregation in some place that would literally implode if they did not engage in streaming or Zooming. I find the whole network of getting this up and running and keeping it going, and Rabbi Heller himself just explained he had to go home because the Wi-Fi wasn't working in the synagogue. And that's only at one end of this whole network of people who are on the receiving end as well of the streaming and the Zooming. There are microphones, and there are speakers, and there are Wi-Fi routers, and there are computers and screens and all sorts of things. Any one of those things can fall apart. And not everybody has the option of walking to a different place and participating in that way. I grew up in the Reform movement. And there was a certain point in my life when I came to the realization that the glue that keeps us together as a people is halakha. And that's what brought me from Reform to conservative Judaism. And I came to conservative Judaism and not to Orthodox Judaism because the intelligence and the integrity and the self-awareness of the rabbinic process in conservative Judaism spoke to me and reassured me that halachic life does not have to be lived in a 17th or 18th or 19th century bubble, but Jewish life can be both halachic and contemporary at the same time. This is one of these places where we bump up against the complexities of this kind of life, but it is, to me, one of the essences of conservative and Masorti Judaism that we remain a halachic movement. The quickness with which the Zooming and the spreading of Zooming and streaming in Masorti and conservative congregations has many people on edge about whether the essence of conservative Judaism is changing and is going to go over the edge to a non-halachic movement. Some people have said to me, this is like the issue of driving on Shabbat. This is one of those pivotal moments in defining the essence of conservative Judaism. And I am truly hoping that that is not the sort of pivot that we are in at this moment. The conservative and the Masorti rabbis and communities who are not in the United States. I'm less familiar with Latin America, but in Israel and in Europe, we are functioning in settings that are already, without this issue, antithetical to what conservative and Masorti halakha is about. We are in a constant state of having to prove our halachic chops, so to speak. And this particular issue of streaming and Zooming is a tremendous challenge to us and creates pressure for us.
Okay.
In a way that it clearly was never intended by Rabbi Heller or by any of the colleagues in any of the congregations that are engaging in these things. But since we are speaking here together, more than a couple hundred people from all over the world, it just seems to me appropriate to mention that that reality that we are dealing with on, as we say, this side of the pond. The issue of the issue of what happens to Jewish community in a time like this. It seems to me that what we have here is actually an opportunity to strengthen Jewish community, to create a dynamic among people who are registered as members of synagogues, very often that communication is one way or two ways. There is information and encouragement and teaching from rabbis and cantors and educators and staff of congregations. And members are often in a rather passive role. And if they are active, they are actively communicating with the central people in their communities, with their rabbis and with their cantors and with the educators and the presidents and the directors. What I see here is an opportunity to create different modes of communication in different directions. To have members of congregations talking to members of congregations, to having members of congregations reaching out and supporting and helping and teaching each other, and creating sub-communities wherever that's geographically possible. We have congregations, of course, all over the place, in suburban areas and even semi-rural areas, as well as urban areas. Just as an example of something that is really, to me, kind of a phenomenon, is here in Israel, in the cities, there are people who stand out on the balconies of their apartment houses, and they create minyanim with the people who are within yelling distance of the other balconies in their apartment houses, so that they can all daven together, even though they're stuck at home and they can't go out. I'm not saying that that's a possible thing for many people in many American Jewish congregations to do, but it's an example of the idea of taking community into your own hands and creating subgroups of people who can support each other and who can create even a minyan together safely, even if it's in a suburban neighborhood in a park, something like that. 10 people can get together, physical distance, and blow a shofar together, or whatever it is that is missing at that particular moment. I hope that this will become a platform for creative thinking, for empowerment of members of communities, for spreading knowledge and skills on levels that are not necessarily spread and disseminated in these ways. And I think that there's the potential here to create a different kind of energy and enthusiasm for Masorti and conservative Judaism that perhaps would never have occurred to us if it had not been for this virus.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Amy Levin. It's wonderful to. If I get one thing to say is like, זה היום קיווינו לו. This is the day that we have all been waiting for. So I will ask Rabbi Amy to mute yourself, to put yourself in the listening mode as we continue with this fascinating discussion. I don't want to be rude. I know that some people are asking questions on the chat. The reason I'm holding it is because we have a few minutes for questions. Some other people have been sending their questions in advance when you registered, but this is the moment in which we will look at what happened with that hak that Rabbi Amy spoke about, and this urgency. Is there urgency or there's no urgency? Pikuach nefesh, is there pikuach nefesh or not pikuach nefesh? We can do things maybe during the week, and it not necessarily is sakanat nefashot, is something that is endangering or jeopardizing the life of anybody, unless it's about preventing people to come together and to follow, in America, the CDC, to follow in other places what their Ministry of Health is stating them. If this is Shema Yitaken, like Rabbi Heller goes to shul and the system doesn't work, and so has to come back, and maybe there's a temptation to just repair that system, if it is writing or if it's not writing. So all those are the kind of things that we are all gonna see together during these questions. But now is my absolutely privilege of introducing you, Rabbi Chaim Wiener, Aseh lecha Rab ukneh lecha chaber, which means
Make for yourself a rabbi and you will find a friend. And Rabbi Wiener became a friend just in the last few days in which we met each other. And thank you for your incredible sechel, your brilliance. As Rabbi Heller wrote his Teshuva, at least was published in May 13th, and the Dissent of Rabbi Amy Levin was on May 26th. This is Masorti Olami. This is the Rabbinical Assembly and Masorti Olami, so it's the conservative movement all around the world. So Rabbi Wiener is going to come with something that he wrote on March 31st. So this is before these two, the Teshuva and the Dissent came up. And it's how the Masorti movement in the UK, but also is translated in other places in Europe, is taking this approach. Rabbi Wiener was ordained at the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem, formerly National Director of Noam Israel, Rabbi of Edgware Masorti Synagogue and New London Synagogue, founder and Director of European Masorti Beit Din, Director of the European region of the Masorti movement, and known for leading inspiring trips to destinations across Europe and his work developing Jewish communities in Europe. So thank you for spreading the word all over to go beyond the Eruv that each one gets in our own bubble, and just to spread the word, mamash yama bakedma safona banegba, all over the world in our topics in Masorti.
Okay. Thank you very much, Analia. Such an introduction. I'm not sure I've had such an enthusiastic introduction. It's a big honor for me to be speaking to everyone here and to be sharing the platform with my rabbinic colleagues from around the world. I've been asked to speak about the response to the Teshuva in Europe. That's my place. I'm in London. And I want to give more of a description rather than kind of a halachic argument one way or the other. I want to describe how the Teshuva was received in our communities and what's happening in our communities before and after. And I want to divide my words really into 4 periods of time. Before the Teshuva, after the Teshuva, and finally the guidance that we give to our communities. And I'll try to do it very quickly. So I'll start with before the Teshuva. The lockdown in London was, I think, the 13th of March, and in Europe was before in the United States. So we had to address the question very early and very quickly. And we consulted with each other. The European rabbis are very close to each other, and we speak certainly weekly and in some cases daily with each other. And we initially had to give guidance, and our initial intuitive guidance that we gave our communities was not to allow streaming on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Our advice to communities was to do other things, to do things on Friday afternoon, to do things on Sundays, to enhance the things that they were doing during the week. But our intuition was not to introduce technology into our communities. And we did a regional-wide shiur, 2 very quickly. We did one on the use of streaming on Shabbat and Yom Tov, which we had a very large audience from across Europe, and that was followed a week later with a shiur with guidance for what to do at the Seder, which also came very early on in the Corona state that we are in now. And our guidance for the Seder was quite similar. By that time, the Rabbinical Assembly had given guidance for streaming and doing things around the Seder. And our advice was to set everything up beforehand and not to touch the technology during the Yom Tov itself. And that was the guidance we gave to our community, and that was more or less a consensus opinion. That's what the rabbis felt, and that's what the communities were happy doing. Then the Teshuva came out, and I have to say that the Teshuva was not welcomed with joy. It was seen as something which undermined our position. It was seen as something that took a movement that was happy with itself and introduced all kinds of uncertainties. And that's just the fact. And I don't want to talk about specific things in the Teshuva. That would be a different debate. But there were three things that I think bothered us about the Teshuva. The first is the Teshuva opens, and Rabbi Heller today opened, with a description of the reality that he was responding to. And I think that he's absolutely right. He describes a certain reality, but that reality isn't our reality. We don't have 15% or 50% of communities that are already streaming. We have 0% communities that are already streaming. We don't have pressure to do that. And it felt to us as North American Teshuva written for the needs of North American communities, and 100% fine. I think that the North American rabbis have a duty to address the needs of their communities. I'm not critical of that on that level, but yet it comes and it impacts us, and no one asked us what's happening in your communities. And no one took that into consideration, and probably no one even cared. So we were left with the results of the Teshuva, but had no input into the Teshuva. The second thing that was problematic for us is a matter of politics. And I think that Amy already mentioned this, that our politics are different than the politics in North America. All of our communities are in places where the mainstream community is Orthodox, and the argument for legitimacy is, are you a proper halachic movement, or are you just another version of reform? And the argument for legitimacy is central for us. And the Jewish press having headlines saying that the conservative movement allows Zooming, which is more or less the way it gets summed up in the popular press, becomes very problematic in a lot of communities with their politics. I had to spend time with the head of the Jewish community in Gothenburg, Sweden, because he felt that the Teshuva undermined the contract within the community for the existence of the egalitarian minyan. And that's an example. So our politics is different, and it wasn't written for our politics, and it didn't support our politics. But mainly the considerations are what we call meta-halachic rather than halachic. And that is that we work very hard in our communities to promote observance and to promote Shabbat. As part of those efforts, the message that we send forward is that Shabbat is a time to wind down, that one of the best things you can do on Friday afternoon is to turn off your phone, is to log off the computer. And how can you give the message saying, turn off your phone, but here's the Zoom link for your service tonight? It just undermines what we really want to be doing as rabbis. So the Teshuva came out, and the response for many, particularly of the rabbinic team, was that this complicates our life a lot. And indeed, it complicated our life a lot. I moved to stage 3. Stage 3 is the aftermath. And I could describe that as World War III. Because what happened in the aftermath of the Teshuva is that in every community, whether it's in Europe or in the United States or in South America, you're constantly balancing different needs of different people within those communities. So the balance that had brought to the original consensus has now been disturbed by the fact that those who did want streaming now say, but that's the position of the conservative movement worldwide. Why don't you follow the rulings of the rabbis in the United States, of the high court, let's say, of the conservative movement? And that led to a period of about 8 weeks of, I can't describe how many different meetings I was in. The UK rabbis, at least twice a week, if not more than that, were discussing this issue and trying to define a new consensus. We had meetings with the European rabbis as an entire group. I had meetings with individual rabbis and individual lay leaders and the different communities, because the balance had been disturbed. And I don't want to go into all the details, but kind of anecdotally, looking back at the machloket, it was quite interesting to see where the lines actually lay. So there was certainly one line between lay leadership and rabbinic leadership, as the rabbis overwhelmingly were against streaming from communities, and there were very strong voices in the lay leadership of communities who felt that they really needed to do streaming in order to maintain communities, because it was Shabbat Chok, all the things that were said here, which of course are equally as true in Europe as they are in other places. So one of the fault lines was between rabbis and lay leaders. But even within the rabbinic group, if overwhelmingly people weren't for streaming, people weren't against in the same way. And it was interesting for me to see that there is also a fault line between young rabbis and old rabbis. And that fault line doesn't fall the way I would have thought, that the older rabbis who were leading large communities were actually more open to some kind of streaming. And the young rabbis, fresh out of seminary, young, idealistic, and kind of in their first pulpit, were the ones who were most opposed to the idea of streaming from the communities. And that played out in all kinds of different formats. But it took us about 8 weeks until we finally worded what we sent out as guidance to communities. There was consensus all around that ultimately the rabbis would decide, and that all the communities would do the same. We didn't want to have communities competing against each other on the basis of who streams and who doesn't stream. So we sent out our final guidance, and our final guidance at the end of the day, interestingly, isn't that different from what came from the movement in the United States. Because indeed, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, and even though I might sound critical, but I feel when I hear these presentations, betoch ami anochi yoshev, I'm sitting amongst my people, because we're all dealing with the same problems. We're all struggling with the need to maintain our communities and need to maintain integrity to the halachic system. But so there are lots of similarities, and yet a lot of the emphasis is different. So in our guidance, it was very important to us that it wasn't guidance about streaming on Shabbat and Yom Tov. That's one of the things that appear in the guidance, but that's not what it's about. About 80% of what we wrote is actually about Shabbat. We wrote about Shabbat, about the importance of Shabbat, about our dreams and aspirations for what we would want Shabbat to look like in modern, liberal, conservative, forward-thinking communities. And there's a huge section on what are the alternatives to streaming. In other words, what are those creative things that we can do? And our communities do absolutely wonderful things. I just have to mention, because it's new this week, that our community in St. Albans, which is a cathedral town just to the north of London, have reached an agreement with the Dean of St. Albans Cathedral. St. Albans Cathedral is the largest cathedral in the United Kingdom, and it's a huge building of tremendous prominence, and we now have an agreement that we're going to be blowing shofar from the bell tower of that cathedral. Now that's thinking outside the box, but that shofar will be heard from a radius for a mile, and people will come to the huge Roman park that surrounds that cathedral, and that's thinking outside of the box. So our Shabbat, 80% is about the importance of Shabbat, or what you can be doing instead. The self-study booklets, meditation booklets for Yom Kippur we're publishing. We're doing tremendously exciting things, and that's not to do with streaming. And yes, there is a page that talks about the streaming. I'm sorry, Analia, I didn't hear you.
Yosher Koach HaKol HaKavod. We would love to leave a little bit of the time for
I'm
for the
finishing
questions and answers.
in 1 second. So there is a sentence on streaming, and the sentence on streaming, we basically recommend to communities, if you have to stream, it needs to be 100% passive. It needs to be set before Shabbat or Yom Tov and left on. And we mention that the recent responsum of Rabbi Heller of the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards describes in detail specific conditions in which the passive streaming can be set up. We acknowledge that. We advise our rabbis, attention should be drawn to the critical response of the Teshuva by Rabbi Amy Levin. And the final sentence is, we wish to emphasize that the use of Zoom meetings, the two-way communication for such streaming, involves clear infractions of halakha and is not permitted. So we allow passive streaming, but ultimately what we really want to push is that there's lots of alternatives, and we think that the real creativity lies there. And with that,
thank you so much, Rabbi Chaim Wellner. We have a fascinating discussion. There's no question about that. And we have plenty of questions that we will love for each one of you to take the stage as long as the questions are addressed to you. There is a very creative way of thinking by Ilana Mushkin. Fantastic. Maybe in Israel, we can get access to the Muazzin Towers, which is definitely going to be a fantastic way of celebrating Rosh Hashanah, actually on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, because the first day is on Shabbat. And then after Ne'ilah, the Tekiyah Gdolah from the Muazzins here in Yerushalayim. We have plenty of questions that have been sent before, and we have even more questions that are in the chat. What we are trying to do is to consolidate some of the questions, because many of the questions have repeated themselves. For those who are interested in the Teshuva of Rabbi Reisner, Rabbi Amy Levin just put the Teshuva of Abraham Reisner. Thank you so much for doing that, because someone asked the question, if we can have access to that Teshuva or to that Dissent. So thank you so much for doing that. We have questions coming from before. And so I would love to address some of them, and as I said before, to consolidate them. Rabbi Arthur Wiener from New Jersey is asking several questions and some comments, so I will only refer to the questions. But the questions is like, why, when we received this Teshuva on May 13th from Rabbi Heller, why we then don't receive the dissents of that Teshuva in such an empowered way as we did the first Teshuva? So the dissent of the other rabbis who did not vote in the Teshuva, why it was not as strong as the Teshuva that was approved by the votes of the law committee and standards. And talking about that part, we can also say what happened in the law committee standards when we create something like that. Somebody is asking as well, do we have one chief in the law committee and standards? I will say this is the Teshuva par excellence. With Hey Ayediah, we say in Hebrew, this Teshuva par excellence of the rabbinical core and corpus, or the rabbinical assembly in general. So that's one thing. I'm going to throw just a few questions as well. There was a question for Rabbi Heller regarding if recording is not as if we are taking a picture. If we are not taking a picture of Shabbat, and we are not supposed to do that, I'm going to mention the name, the person who asked the question, Ilana Mushkin. Thank you for your question. Is recording the same way that is establishing something that you mentioned, the same ketubah, the toladot hakotev, the toladot ketiva, if that is not something that stays there. So let's go into, do we have one authority? Do we have this issue of recording? Do we have any consensus of the entire movement, or everybody can go on their own way?
So there are, if you look within the law committee, there are tshuvot, if you look at the law committee, there are tshuvot for and against recording on Shabbat. All of them agree that that the recording needs to be set up before Shabbat. So one could argue that that recording is not ketiva d'oraita because the recording itself is not visible, right? If I look at a computer, I can't tell that the recording is in there. I would also note, by the way, that when you are streaming, the information is recorded and transferred many times, but it is not permanent. But in terms of the spirit of the law, starting a recording, I would argue, is a violation of Shabbat. So therefore, what I said in my tshuva is that it is okay potentially that there's already policies about recording services on Shabbat. So some synagogues have a camera, like so many synagogues have security cameras on Shabbat, but there the intention is different, right? It's not that I am looking to watch that footage unless, God forbid, something bad happened. But so the argument would be that starting recording on Shabbat is ktiva because I am intentionally recording something. If the recording was set up before Shabbat and it is merely recording what I am doing, that is not necessarily a violation. So if it's not a voice-activated recording, but literally no matter what I do, so on this Zoom right now, no matter what bits and bytes are being recorded, what I say determines which bits and bytes, but no matter what, something is being written down. So the argument for recording would be that if the recording is set up before Shabbat, you're not causing anything further to happen. The argument against would be that you are, even just by talking, causing a permanent record. Now, the issue is in most places in the world, you cannot avoid being recorded on Shabbat. You can't walk down a street in any major city without being on CCTV. Although that is something that you don't necessarily want to have happen, it's supposed to hear where it's more intentional. So the answer is a little bit of elu va'elu, but those are the two lines of reasoning.
So Rabbi Amy, you have something to add to this? We will do it briefly so we can move to other questions.
Yeah, so first I want to go back to the issue of dissent. Because dissents are not voted on, they do not have the same standing as a tshuva, and that is why dissents are not disseminated the way tshuvos are disseminated, the way responses are disseminated. I have actually been asked by a number of people to turn my dissent into a tshuva so it can be voted on, so it can be sent around, and I'm considering doing that. In terms of whether there's one tshuva and there's one opinion and everybody has to follow it, one of the major principles, again, of Rabbinic Judaism is the institution of the role of the rabbi in a community as the Mara Da'atra, as the decisive of halakha, of Jewish law, for his or her community. So we do not have opinions or halachic opinions and practices that are globally imposed on all conservative rabbis and Masorti rabbis, save for a very limited number, which are considered to be standards of practice for conservative and Masorti clergy, which go through a very different process. In terms of the writing, this was one of the reasons why I had difficulty with Rabbi Heller's tshuva, and he and I wrote back and forth about this a little bit. I don't see any reason to record anything on Shabbat, to create that recording, whether it be voice or whether it be just the data behind the camera, behind the screen, whatever it is that is going on. And even if it is only a rabbinic prohibition, I think rabbinic prohibitions are to be taken seriously as well. And so the issue of all of the different kinds of recording on different levels that are going on in our control and not in our control were one of the major factors in my writing this event.
Thank you so much. I will go ahead and also consolidate a few questions at the same time that people are asking in different ways, but actually bring us to basically the same maslul, the same path. One of the questions is that also from Rabbi Wiener from New Jersey, that one of the questions is like some of the congregations have used this equipment, both streaming and Zooming, even before the tshuva came up. So that gives that legitimacy to our movement that is actually coming from another question. And what happened after all this is over? Are some people are gonna stay for that? Somebody asked a very interesting question regarding, this is Ben Langton, is asking the question, for us, for all of us that we are Shomrei Shabbat and we are under the very, very scrutiny of the meaning of muktzeh, it could be that we decide just to close our computers and just go on with the Menuchat Shabbat, which actually I truly recommend that you print in recycled paper all the Teshuvot and the Dissents and everything else, and you read them during Shabbat because they are very interesting, and you will take about 4 hours to read all of them, which is absolutely incredible. But the question is, maybe for those Jews that are a 3-time-a-year Jew, the concept of the argument could be Oev et kol habriot umekarvam laTorah. Just to bring people in order to offer for them, maybe during the high holidays, this opportunity to get engaged, or maybe while they are at home, the opportunity to get engaged because they don't have to dress up and go to shul, but shul comes to them. So let's go with all these 3 questions. The first one that is related to is this, this implement of the Zoom and streaming was done before the Teshuva. Where does put our movement as an halachic movement going forward? And what happened with the ones who decided that actually they are a 3-day Jew or 2-day Jew in a year, and the only thing that attracts them is Mekarvam LaTorah in those days, but nevertheless, this could be a possibility to bring them into the Shabbat table.
So there's a long-standing tradition. There's a long-standing tradition of poskim being mezakeh et harabim. That there are a lot of times that you read a tshuva where rabbis say, people are already doing X. If they're going to do X, I would rather them do it this way. So I think actually one of the failings of our movement is that many congregations are doing music on Shabbat. And we have never succeeded in coming up with guidelines for how to do it in a way which is more respectful of Shabbat. So this is one of those things where we are a very diverse movement. And I think having the guidelines in place helps congregations. Some people are always going to be ahead of the curve on issues, helps guide a mainstream to do things in a way which is more prudent and is closer to within the Daled Amot. In my tshuva, I actually say, I want everyone to stay within the Daled Amot. If you are going outside, the lines, then at least stay close, and here is how to do that. The question of muktzeh. So in theory, if you're doing this right, you are not touching your computer at all. That is the nature of muktzeh. You're not supposed to even touch it. So literally, you should not have to touch your computer if you're doing this right. That being said, there are different kinds of muktzeh, and in the paper I go through, is a laptop muktzeh machmat kasron kis? Is it muktzeh, like that? Basically, I actually have a video. There's a link to a video of someone using an iPad as a cutting board in their kitchen. So you could use an iPad for something else. But little rabbi joke there. But I think the question of muktzeh is fair, and I think one of the things for those of us who lean towards observant is to encourage people to make a distinction. And look, I will also say any community that can serve its people, or any individual who can have a Shabbat experience without using technology, tavo alehem bracha. So when I went on vacation, and I was very happy for my computer to have shvitat kelim, for my computer to rest as well, and to daven on my own, even though I could have left my computer on from where I was and logged into my synagogue, right? Part of, I think, being a rabbi of a congregation is sacrificing some of one's own avirah, one's own experience, in order to share with others. And that's a sacrifice that I know that I make when I do things this way.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Heller. Rabbi Amy.
Yeah, so I just want to add a couple of things. The issue of Shabbat being the central Jewish experience. Here in Israel, no one has been streaming or Zooming at all for months and months and months before we were allowed back into our synagogue building. Almost universally, every community here was doing Kabbalat Shabbat up until candle lighting, and then often would also pick up right after Havdalah and have a Havdalah service and a Mari service together. The Kabbalah services in particular were powerful experiences for people, and people in the community I was involved in were telling me over and over again that just being able to hear those melodies, Zoom, unfortunately, you can't really sing together, but to hear those melodies that are iconic melodies that bring in Shabbat was very powerful for them. And also to hear Dvar Torah was a very powerful experience for them. And the fact that we turned it off right before candle lighting was fine for everybody. People didn't feel that they missed those elements of Shabbat. In my dissent, I had suggested similar things, that cantors get on line during Elul. We can sing so many of the iconic melodies of the Yamim Noraim, of the days of awe, that would help people to feel closer to the experience without having to cross that line. For rabbis to give sermons, to teach. The Sephardic Jewish community has active slichot and active Elul experiences the entire month. Unlike most Ashkenazi communities where it's only the Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah. It's possible to build up this sense and this spirit of this whole period of the days of awe without crossing the line into the streaming and the Zooming.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Amy Levin. I really tried to consolidate many of the questions. We have about 20 to 25 questions, and we are running out of time because I would love to introduce two very important people. But let me say first that this is an incredible opportunity for all to learn from and with these three distinguished rabbis and how we implement in our own way. But this is an incredible day for the Masorti movement, Masorti Olami, and the Rabbinical Assembly as well, that as many of us, we have been the recipients of the sechel, of the brightness of the movement, and to make the movement an halachic movement, and at the same time to adapt to different moments that we are living today, especially during this pandemic. Somebody might make a comment here that let me, I don't want to paraphrase, a comment that says this is a reminiscence of the time in which the Rabbinical Assembly and the conservative movement were voting and were discussing the issues of women in the rabbinate. And then on a private message I received, this reminds me when the Rabbinical Assembly and the conservative movement and the Jewish laws and standards were discussing the issue of the ordination of gays and lesbians, of the LGBTQ community. And I really hope that nobody was intending to say that actually we are looking back to a vaccine for those moments, both for the rabbis, women rabbis in the pulpit, and for the acceptance of integration of everybody or inclusivity into our movement. Because we have the zchut, the privilege of being a part of a movement that really brings us to the modern times, but at the same time keeps the essence of the halacha. And this is why just 6 minutes late of what I was, 7 minutes late of what I was supposed to do now is to introduce two people that are the central core of our movement all over the world. Rabbi Philip Shame. Rabbi Philip Shame is the president of Masorti Olami and is past president of the International Rabbinical Assembly. And he is entering his 40th year as a rabbi of Beth David congregation in Toronto, Kol HaKavod. And Rabbi Mauricio Balter. Rabbi Mauricio Balter is, first of all, a friend for decades and decades and decades, at least for 40 decades. Mauricio is an amigo from all of us. He's a wonderful friend to our family. and he is the director and the executive director of Masorti Olami and Merkaz Olami. And so it's our incredible zchut and honor to introduce two icons of the rabbinate today that really spread the word into the world about this conservative movement and the different Shubbot. I want to thank again all those who are behind the scenes. I want to thank Ilana and Jacob, Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal and Rabbi Ilana Garber. I want to thank Teila. I want to thank Rabbi Chaim Weiner and Rabbi Amy Levin and Rabbi Joshua Heller. And the stage is for Rabbi Philip Shane and for Rabbi Mauricio Balter.
Toda Rabba, thank you, Rabbi Bortz, very much for your moderating this very exciting and historic discussion. And just a very brief comment. In my 2 minutes, you will probably hear some background noise in my synagogue because live streaming equipment is being installed as we speak. And which I couldn't plan it better this way, but it kind of indicates the fact that we will not Zoom on Shabbat or Yom Tov. And we have to be prepared to somehow bring in our larger community into the tefillot that will be coming up in the Yimim Noraim. I just want to acknowledge in one moment the elephant in the shul, and which hasn't been said in all of the discussion today, and that is if we go PC pre-COVID-19, we recognize that many of our synagogues were struggling. Many synagogues of all denominations were struggling, and survival was not a certainty. Come COVID-19, we recognize that for most of our congregations, at least in North America, and I imagine in other parts of the world, the high holidays are very significant in terms of people rejoining the shul. It's a major incentive for people to reconnect, to pay their dues, and to make our synagogues viable. And there's no question but that many of our communities are really scared that this coming season, without the ability to physically come to shul on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, will be very challenging in terms of the long-term survival, or even short-term survival of our communities. So that's something we have to recognize as part of the motivation for live streaming equipment being installed right across the door from my office and in our building and in many other communities to make this possible. I want to acknowledge very briefly wonderful, wonderful leaders of our Masorti world who have made today possible and done much more than that. Rabbi Joshua Heller, I am convinced that for generations, his Teshuva will be studied as a model of halachic scholarship for its brilliance and for its taking in so much and for teaching so much of great relevance during this time of struggle. It will be a model for a long time to come of what true, serious halachic scholarship is all about. And to Rabbi Amy Levin and to Rabbi Chaim Weiner for your very learned and heartfelt dissents. I think we've learned a great deal from you as well, and what you have said will resonate. To Rabbi Analia Bortz for being a wonderful moderator and bringing South America into the discussion, which is very important. To our Tzeva, to our Masorti Olami staff, Rabbi Mauricio Balter, and the incredible Tehila Rubin, Rabbi Mauricio, who had this idea for today's program and for a series that will follow of bringing together our movement worldwide to discuss these critical issues. Tehila, who basically is the engine that brings all of this together. To the Rabbinical Assembly, Rabbi Blumenthal, Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal, and Rabbi Ilana, and to all those who have been involved in the RA staff as well for making today possible. Toda Rabba L'kulchem. Thank you to all of you. I'm now honored to turn things over to my dear friend, Executive Director of Masorti Olami and Merkaz Olami, Rabbi Mauricio Balter.
Erev Tov from Israel for all of you. Really, I am very happy because this is the spirit of the movement, what we lived the last 1.5 hours is really the spirit of the pluralistic approach to the halacha. To think this is very important, don't forget that we have a pluralistic approach to halacha. And the second thing, this is the new spirit of the movement, where all the arms of the movement work together and partners in different activities and projects. Only the proof is that the next week we have another Zoom, another streaming about community building in a time of Corona. I want to invite all of you to join us to Rabbinical Assembly and to Masorti Olami. You can see the link at the chat at this moment for registration. we will talk about different ideas and topics of spirituality, liturgy, and virtual community building to prepare us for high holidays and very challenged times. As all of you are invited, I want to thank all of you, all the participants to join us. Thank you very much. Arbe Briut, and be careful.